Final Fantasy 7 and 8 carry so much opinion, it's easy to forget that they weren't the last instalment on the Sony PlayStation. Final Fantasy 9's a really interesting one, and it's the one that, before this, I knew absolutely nothing about.
It's the year of the millennium, and Sony had just upped the ante in the console wars by releasing the PlayStation 2. But this was also the release year of Final Fantasy 9, and I do wonder if the fact that people were moving on from the first PlayStation hampered the game. While 6.08 million copies of Final Fantasy VIII were sold in 1 year, Final Fantasy IX only had sold 5.5 million copies by 2016. 500,000 less than Final Fantasy VIII 16 years after its release. Couple that with the release of the phenomenal Final Fantasy X just a year later, which is one of my favourite games of all time, and it's easy to see why this is the forgotten game of the series.
But sales and attention don't necessarily lead to an amazing game. Let's remember how good 7 and 8 really are. So now with 9, after 3 attempts on the PlayStation, they should be at a point now where they can make something truly remarkable. Did they pull it off? Let's find out and start with the graphics.
Now, why am I showing you footage of the Ocarina of Time? It's because the graphical switch between Final Fantasies 8 and 9 remind me greatly of the switch between Ocarina of Time and Wind Waker. I'd had, by 1998 standards, a super realistic 3D Zelda, and for Wind Waker they went with a cel-shaded cartoon outlook, and I hated it so much it ruined the game for me. It was only when I played the Wind Waker HD remake did I really understand that I was wrong, and it was actually an amazing game.
Final Fantasy IX is way more cartoony than Final Fantasy VIII or even Final Fantasy VII, and I found it a bit jarring to begin with, to be honest. But then I thought about it, and do you know what? It kinda makes sense.
Outside of CGI cutscenes, the original version of Final Fantasy VIII looks ropey now to say the least, hence why the remaster was essential. But with Final Fantasy IX, its style means it stands the test of time easier and needs only minor cosmetic updates. It's smart, but by and large, I can't help feeling it's a step backwards. In other words, I'm torn on it.
The game is more medieval than sci-fi, harping back to the older Final Fantasy games, and I for one really do appreciate it. You can tell that with the characters and the backgrounds, this really was created by a Final Fantasy fan.
And they didn't just stop with the looks either. The game really leans heavily on the old Final Fantasy games in terms of music as part of the back-to-basics approach of the game. This is nowhere more evident than the beginning of the battle music, which returns to the same opening chords that 1 to 6 used, but were not used in 7 and 8. There's a certain warmth and familiarity with that, and it'll be the last time those famous bars were ever used in a mainstream title.
However, the bar has been set by Final Fantasy VII, and is the music better than Final Fantasy VII? Not for me.
Now on to gameplay, and Final Fantasy games often live or die on their characters, and the lead protagonist of Final Fantasy games are often the least interesting of the party. Cloud from Final Fantasy VII? I found him bland. Squall is without a doubt the least interesting teammate in Final Fantasy VIII. Same with Tidus in 10 and Noctis in 15. So what about Zidane?
I kind of like him. He seems like a bit of a cheeky chappy, he keeps striking out with the ladies all the time, which is quite funny. Seems like a good kid.
He also looks like a Saiyan, which is never going to be a bad thing. In fact, most of the initial game's characters feel pretty rich. I love the evolution of Steiner as he starts to realise the shades of grey in the world. Princess Garnet or Dagger may be a little bit of a weak link, but Vivi and the evolution of his confidence also is great to be a part of.
So, what about the plot? What's this one about?
Zidane's boss Baku is heading to Alexandria, pretending to be a theatre production, but with the actual intention of kidnapping Princess Garnet. In the meantime, Vivi, who's been sold a dodgy ticket to the performance, meets a young rat kid called Puck, and they climb across roofs to break into the castle. It turns out that Princess Garnet is actually happy with being kidnapped, and despite the best efforts of Steiner, who is the head of the Knights of Pluto, Steiner, Garnet and Vivi all end up on the airship as it makes its escape. The airship takes heavy damage and crashes in Evil Forest.
And this for me is where the game has its first problem. I'm now an hour in, and all I've done is walk around a little bit, talk to a few people, had a few fake battles, nothing much is really going on. It kind of makes me yearn for the older Final Fantasy games where they just chuck you into a battle straight from the get-go.
This part of the game also introduces a new feature, the Active Time event. These are additional cutscenes that show you what's happening to the characters your lead character have been separated from. And it sounds like a really cool idea.
Unfortunately, in a game that has loads of cutscenes and plot, the last thing that it requires is more cutscenes and plot. But then there's the paranoia that you might miss something important, even though 95% of the cutscenes are a complete waste of time. It's really, really annoying. And sometimes you even find yourself with your team split up just so that they can have 4 additional cutscenes for no apparent reason. Drives me up the wall.
So I'm finally battling proper enemies and I make my way to the first mini-boss and I come across my next 2 issues. Firstly, bosses do not give you XP. I thought this may be a one-off in this battle, but nope. Every single boss you get gil and AP but no XP. Then there's Final Fantasy IX's biggest battle gimmick, trance. When you trance, your attacks become massively stronger, the only problem being that it happens so infrequently that you'd be forgiven for forgetting it's even a thing.
I find the lack of XP for bosses really annoying. Imagine slugging your way through this massive fight only for it not to reward you with a strength increase for your party. It should be against RPG law.
Remember the massively complex junction system in Final Fantasy VIII? Well, don't worry about that here. Like I said, it's back to basics, so just like the old days, you'll spend most of your time getting Zidane to attack by constantly pressing A, Vivi to use his magic, although which one you use seems to rarely make any difference, and Dagger using Cure All Life. The only party member with a bit more to think about is Steiner, who has a few more options like combination strikes with Vivi. It all feels very basic, and if that's what you like, it's great. For me, and especially for the early parts of the game, I didn't really feel like I was engaging my brain much.
So we rescue the princess and we run away from all of the bad guys and we get locked out of the forest away from the rest of our crewmates. We have a little sleep, and then I discover the next annoying feature. The really, really annoying controls for the overworld map on Final Fantasy VII are back with a vengeance.
I don't know if the reason I didn't experience this in Final Fantasy VIII is because I was playing the remastered version and they may have fixed it, but the overworld controls were awful in Final Fantasy VII and they're awful here. It's very rare I seem to go in the direction I want.
At this point, the arrival in the ice cabin was a welcome release just to hack up a few baddies.
Also, we get a really cool boss battle with the first Black Waltz. If you attack the Sea Lion, the Black Waltz will cure him, so you need to whack the Waltz first and then turn your attention to the Sea Lion, whose ball in his chest will signal how much damage you've done. We head for Lindblum, but we don't have clearance to get through the gate, so we backtrack to the village of Dali. This point is why it's been so long between this review and the last.
I couldn't work out a way forward and I was just too bored to care. I put the game down and I wouldn't pick it up for another 6 months.
But pick it back up I did. I was determined I was going to do this review. I eventually discover an underground passage and find a Vivi clone factory. Meanwhile, Steiner organises a lift back to Alexandra on a Black Mage ship to take the princess home. Black Waltz number 2 accosts us and says he's going to take the princess back to Alexandra. He's not, and I whoop him. We jump on board and Zidane intends to redirect the ship to Lundblum. We end up in another battle with Black Waltz number 3, and then something weird happens.
So the Black Mages step in to protect us from the Black Waltz, and I didn't really understand why, to be honest. I know some of them become sentient a little bit later on in the game, but these ones don't appear to be sentient, so surely they would be on the Black Mages' side. It didn't make any sense to me. If you understand why, answer in the comment section. I'd really like to know.
Black Waltz number 3 puts up a decent fight, but ultimately he falls. We then charge towards the southern air gate entrance in a breathtaking cutscene that sees the Black Waltz chase our airship and then blow him and the southern air gate up. This looks fantastic.
And we're in Lindblum. Buckle up, people, this is not going to be a short visit.
Zidane bumps into his old friend Freya. Dagger goes to see her uncle Regent Sid, who reveals he organised Baku to kidnap her. Dagger, for some reason, decides to confront her mother on her behaviour, thinking it will change her mind, having clearly never looked at her. I mean, seriously, did you not ever think, my mum looks pretty evil? Also, how did this give birth to this? Uncle Sid clearly knows this is stupid, but does nothing to stop her. Meanwhile, the other characters wander aimlessly around the town doing a lot of nothing. Zidane and Dagger have a moment, and then we're on to the Festival of the Hunt.
So in the Festival of the Hunt, you face a load of inane enemies all over town, and you earn points for beating them. It was only after I looked it up and discovered you get the best possible prize by losing. Pointless.
Bermercia is under attack, and they presume Alexandria is behind it. Dagger thinks she can talk her mum out of it because she's clearly stupid. Zidane says she thinks she should stay behind to protect herself. Sure, they've been fighting alongside each other for ages and she's the only person who can cast Cure, but the plot requires her and Steiner to split off, so a domestic is deemed the best possible way to accomplish this.
I'm going to fast forward because people don't really want to hear me continuously moan about the lack of action in this game. I was coming up to the 10-hour mark, and just as I was getting excited about the fact that I wasn't going to have to play it anymore, the game suddenly stepped up a gear.
Battling to protect a town that had lost its historical defence system, making choices that could lead townsfolk to either die or survive, playing against the backdrop of the dagger abduction and betrayal, along with the town's destruction. We follow that up with the rescue mission in Alexandria, which sees Beatrix, who's been whooping us every time we come into contact with her, turning against the Queen, and Steiner coming to the realisation the Queen is not what he thought she was, and breaking free of his shackles to help the cause. The more interesting plot, action sequences, coupled with the already deep and likeable characters, finally made this game pop. I was hooked.
I ended up giving Final Fantasy IX way more than the 10 hours that I was supposed to, because it finally felt like it was getting somewhere. I'm not sure how fair it is. I mean, how much better would 7 or 8 have marked, or maybe less, if I'd given them more than the 10 hours that I gave them, but it just felt like the right thing to do, so bugger it.
Lifespan-wise, Final Fantasy IX is a disc less than 8, and is renowned for being a shorter game, more close to 7 in length. I do wonder how long the game would have been minus all the padding out of the story that's taken place.
To be honest, none of these reviews have been as easy as I thought they'd be. With this game, on the one hand, you have the fact that it's a beautiful love letter to the older games. On the other hand, despite an incredible cast of characters, it takes an inordinate amount of time to get going.
I can really see why it's been chosen out of every Final Fantasy for a proper animated series.
If you can get through the opening 9 to 10 hours where everything seems to take so much longer than it needs to, then there's an RPG in there that can go toe-to-toe with any one of the games in the franchise. That is, however, a hell of a commitment to ask for.
Well done.